everyone. Welcome back to Thought Crime and Keto and Crime. Today we're starting the third novel in Chad Daybell's series, Standing on Holy Ground, Rise of Zion. In the last novel we kind of looked into, the defeat of the coalition by the Saints at Mile High Stadium in Denver. We watched them march from Denver on magical school buses and all that stuff to Independence, Missouri, where they started to build New Jerusalem, and they laid down the foundation and blessed the ground for the building of the New Jerusalem temple. And that's where we ended. So this book picks up right after that, and we're about to get into it. But first, a huge shout out to my patrons and channel members, all my subscribers. Love you all. If you want to join my patrons and channel members, those links are down below. Also, if you are subscribed to this channel or were subscribed, please make sure to check that and make sure you're still subscribed. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that. It helps the channel more than you know. Like, comment, share. I really appreciate all the wonderful comments. I'm glad you are enjoying these. I'm enjoying these. This one, though, was the hardest to get through. I have to admit that. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Rise of Zion. This novel was around 200 pages, 27 chapters. I did read it on Kindle. It's not available on Audible. He didn't do that with this series, it appears. And he basically says again, this is fiction based on end of times predictions in the biblical Book of Revelation as well as the Book of Mormon. He gives a shout out to LDS President Thomas S. Munson, saying how much he likes him and how he easily pictured him as the president or prophet that he focused on in the first two novels, which, if you know what is about to happen, is really, really morbid, but that's Chad. So he liked this president. Anybody LDS want to comment on him? I guess I should have looked him up, but it was enough of a struggle to get through this book. So, and now he kind of gives us the rundown of the summary. A year has passed since they dedicated the ground in Independence, Missouri for the New Jerusalem temple. It's been a mild winter, but they have built New Jerusalem into a wonderful functioning city with solar power and all this wonderful stuff. Every family has their own house or apartment, fully powered by solar. And then he talks about the laws of consecration, that everybody in the city lives by the law of consecration, meaning they share everything that they have to make sure everybody has the same level of living. Chad, that sounds a lot like socialism, and I know from the bylaws of the many prepper groups you were in that you guys are vehemently anti-socialism. I don't like it myself. But safety nets are a different thing. We can talk about that. Produced by capitalist means. But this is 100% pure socialism, if not communism, the way that this sounds. And Chad is putting that forth as the promised land. So Chad, what's messed up in your brain? But anyway. So anyway, it talks about how coalition forces were defeated and how everyone's living the sweet life in New Jerusalem, and that how everybody, except people that were really wealthy in the previous life, are having no issues with this law of consecration. He says this many times, that people that were wealthy have a real problem with this, assimilating to what is a normal, I guess, everybody's at a middle class kind of living here. But the people that were middle class or poor have no problem with it. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a step. It's no change for people that were middle class. It's a step up for people that were poor. But if people were rich, I can see how that would. And you also have to realize, Chad, that probably the people that were rich brought the most supplies with them. So, yeah. How you can be so conservative and so, Republican in your views and a lot of your other books, and then yet talk about essentially what AOC is talking about as the promised land is just funny to me. It's like everything in your head is just a lie. So anyway, sorry about that rant. Let's get back into the story. In addition to outfitting the former Kansas City, Missouri to be New Zion and repairing all the former houses that were there for people to live in and getting them fully outfitted with solar, they're also destroying any evil remnants of the previous society. So any magazines that Chad Daybell, magazines, books, VHS tapes, DVDs, Blu-rays. I mean, like I said, he wrote this 2004 to 2009. He wrote the series of books. So anything, I guess, that was available in that time period that he didn't agree with, these people are destroying because it could lead to evil. And everybody that was expected to work hard for the good of the community, again, Chad, socialism, which I've heard you speak against many times. Your heart, you sit on a throne of lies, Chad. He talked about, for a time, a small rendition of formerly wealthy people not liking it, wanting kind of to separate, and how the first presidency wouldn't hear them, and how they had to understand that it wasn't about accumulation of wealth anymore. It was about the good of the community. Again, Chad, totally anti to how you lived your life. You didn't start your book company to do it for the good of the community. You did it to build a more financially stable atmosphere for your family. Again, Chad's full of lies. Anyway, and then he talks about people that weren't in Zion, not necessarily LDS, but people that had survived the coalition invasion of 30,000 troops with swords. All the Americans with guns that managed to survive that huge invasion of 30,000 troops are now living as rural tribes with no real government out in the boonies somewhere. He talked about the large cities in America that were still alive were occupied by lawless gangs. Chief among them in Salt Lake City was Sherhim. Remember him? Larry Campbell? The one that we heard all about in the last novel. Yeah, he's still in control of Salt Lake City. Then they talk about how Russia and China, there was a power struggle with Russia coming out on top. I guess Putin's just Putin away. And how there was a worldwide economic collapse, and how all the governments in South America just collapsed. All of them. Not one survived. And all of the saints there had fled up through, South Central America into Mexico and into the United States, primarily from Guatemala, because remember, all the Mayans are Mormon. And also how in Europe, saints in Europe had been guided by their elders to places of sanctuary all over Europe, namely Siberia. He actually named Siberia as a place where a lot of Mormons from Europe were led to escape way into Eastern Europe. Siberia, where the Soviet government banished criminals. That's a place of refuge in Chad Daybell's world. So, and then it talks about still some more natural disasters and how, all the economies are splintered, and how the rest of the coalition collapsed because Russia and China could not get together. They pretty much abandoned their troops in America and never even came in to check on them. Never even realized why they just disappeared off the face of the earth. It's only 30,000. I mean, it's a small force. Maybe they just forgot. And they talked about how they had slowly, spread their love all over Missouri and Kansas, and how people that arrived, new people, these from these refugee camps that are all over the country, people that were arriving, if they agreed to learn Mormon ways and become Mormon, and again, live by that law of consecration, that they would have a house given to their family, as long as they offered to donate everything that they had to the mutual cause. And the men and boys that were over 16 would spend their time helping to renovate other houses for other people for the first 3 months of them being in Zion. And then women, 16 and up, if they would spend their time doing, planting gardens, doing that, feeding livestock, cooking, sewing, teaching children, women's work, because this is Chad Daybell. And I'm sure there's a lot of men out there that are offended that they have to go, build the houses. Why can't those men garden? Nothing unmanly about planting some corn. If you think there is, you need to talk to the entire state of Iowa and Nebraska and see what they tell you. But anyway, so he said everyone was basically happy, and they had no real interest in pursuing evil habits because you've destroyed everything that's fun, probably. And then he goes into talking about the characters we all know and love. Tad and Emma North live in New Jerusalem with their children, 18-year-old David, 16-year-old Charles, 11-year-old Leah. Actually, now it would probably be David's 19, Charles is 17, and Leah is 12. So, since Tad, before he was an accountant, was a brick mason, he was helping to build the temple site's main plaza, and Emma was running their wards garden, because this huge city was broken down in wards, just like they were in, before the coalition's 30,000 troops with swords. And they worked about 4 hours a day doing that stuff, and then they were also part of a team led by the First Presidency to reestablish the LDS Church's curriculum materials to spread all over the country, because they still got to proselytize. And yeah, Doug and Becky Dalton, he had, as you remember, Doug was made one of the 144,000 high priests and he had been sent all around the country to bring back faithful saints that perhaps had been hidden elsewhere, bring them back to Zion. He was also had been sent to New York City for a year, where he currently is, helping to find displaced Mormons in New York City, or anybody of any faith that wants to adhere again to the laws of consecration and come back to Zion are welcome. Becky has been caring for their 3 children, and their 2 children, Justin and Heather, are attending school. Their little toddler, Daniel, the one without an arm and a disfigured leg, he's still toddling along, the one that the president in the last novel said wouldn't live long. And so it was, just a nice little society. Then we turn to Josh and Kim Brown. Remember, they were the brother-in-law and sister-in-law of the Norths and the Daltons, and they were in Guatemala. They're the ones that led the Mayan Mormons through Mexico, from Guatemala into Mexico, into Arizona, and now to New Zion. They are living amongst these Guatemalans in New Zion, helping to build their community. Remember, Kim was pregnant in the last novel. Well, she has given birth to twins, Timothy and Tina, and they're about 12 months old. So they're just building their little Guatemalan society. Josh is working for the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which is, I guess, just under the First Presidency, and yeah. And from here we can get into the story. Miko Petrov wasn't really mentioned in the forward, but remember him, the little Bulgarian guy that was a Mormon that found the chalkboard. where they had written down their plans and erased it. He is actually still out west, helping to find survivors and move them towards Zion. So he's still around. And then we cut to New York City and all of its devastation. Remember last time there was a Mormon spy there that had to swim across the Hudson to find food. Even though if you really tried to swim the Hudson, you'd probably end up with two eyeballs in the middle of your head. But anyway, so we go to Doug. Remember, Doug is there, who is Emma North's brother. He is there looking for survivors, working for the church. And he's kind of surveying the destruction around New York City. He goes to the Empire State Building just to kind of look around. Almost the entire Empire State Building, which was hit heavily by coalition forces coming into the Atlantic. Because they came in on two different sides of the country. You had, 30,000, so you had 15 and 15. And all those troops were able to level New York City. There's like 100 times more people in New York City, and a lot of them have guns. How did this happen? Anyway, so no electricity. Entire Empire State Building collapsed. He's living at the New York City Mormon Temple that has good light from the sun, and they hunt around for food, canned supplies that might be left. He and his people are just kind of scouring Manhattan, seeing what they can find. Sounds like a really raging good time. Meanwhile, the Spirit speaks to him and says that he needs to journey outside of New York City, down into the southern half of the state and on into Pennsylvania to find more survivors. And he does just that. In fact, the Spirit leads him to go as far as Washington, D.C., which is supposedly in ruins, and the government of the United States collapsed, so no one knows where the president is, or the former president, the senators, congressmen, nobody knows where any of them are. They just disappeared. So he's told by the Spirit to go to the Washington, D.C. temple and look around. And to do that, he has to travel through Pennsylvania. And he happens to meet a man by the name of Ezekiel while traveling through rural Pennsylvania. And Ezekiel is Amish, and he leads Chad to an Amish community, because they always lived off the grid anyway, that were kind of ignored by the coalition troops because they were certainly never chipped. They had no electricity, nothing that would, lead anybody to them, and he stays with them a few days, and they talk about how in line Mormon theology and the Amish theology were, and I guess I got to say, Chad, are they Mormon too? Is that what you're trying to tell us, that the Amish are actually Mormon? Anyway, so he realizes they don't have enough food to go as far as they wanted to, so he goes back to New York for just a little bit to do some more scouring, and he, while they're looking for food and supplies to make that trip to Washington, D.C., he kind of goes into this backlash where we're told about all of the bad things that have ever happened. Nothing was like this. They talked about, of course, 9/11, Wall Street in the 2008 crash, the housing bubble, home mortgage crisis, the recession, and how, people had voted for change after that. And after he said that, remember way back when we talked about what president this might be, we speculated in the other series, the Times of Turmoil series that we read before this, that it was probably Obama, because those were written in 2012. Well, since we now know that these are a side-by-side series, and these books were actually starting to be read in written in 2004, then I estimated it was probably Bush. But I thought it was strange that he was railing against a Republican president, because we all know, conservative dude. Not that, conservative dude. But now he mentions Barack Obama by name and says that people voted for this change and a sense of hope to get out of the 2008 recession, and that how Obama's huge measures to redistribute wealth put the nation on the teetering point, that relations with China and Russia kind of went on the downstem, and then he got into the creation of the chip, the false, prop up of the economy with the chip money. And then he talked about how the federal government seized many independent businesses and nationalized a lot of industry. Chad, you're talking about communism. You're talking about the evils of communism, yet you just spent 2 chapters railing about the law of consecration in Zion. That's the same thing. That's redistribution of wealth, and you're talking about it here as if it's evil. And so that's why I have a real problem with it, because you're forcing people to live by this redistribution of wealth in Zion, and you're saying how it is what caused all this trouble here. Again, lies. And they talked about how there was a concerted effort to crush small business. That's nothing new, Chad. Small business has always received, no matter who's in power, government's help at the very last minute. Their deals have always been with the corporations, with, their relationships with corporations. They can, impact ways of life and philosophy and culture and the economy a lot more through corporations. And so there's always that link between government and corporations. That's not new. And then he talks about how Obama led us down to a weakened state and allowed the coalition invasion to take place, even though he started writing this and talking about all these problems 2004 when President Bush was in. And then, of course, this book was probably written 2009. So, yes, he was probably pissed off that Obama was president. And not saying Obama's perfect. Bush wasn't. No president has ever been perfect. But, Chad, get your economic theories straight. You're railing against the United States heading down a path to communism and how bad that, or socialism and how bad that was. And yet you're talking about Zion living under essentially the same rules, where you can't accumulate wealth and you either work for the good of the common man, the good of the common good, or you can't stay there. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It is the same thing. Redistribution of wealth by force is socialism. So you have no... So after having all these wonderful flashbacks, he packs up his supplies and again departs for Washington, D.C. And then we cut to Emma and Tad living in their little house in New Jerusalem. She has this whole epiphany about how their entire life pre-coalition invasion, that they were never allowed, they never saved enough money to buy a house. And yet they have one here, mortgage free. And she talks about how wonderful it is, to have that. I can see how that would happen. And then she's working with the gardens and the educational system, and how Tad is now working as a brick mason, even though he had no experience in it that we knew of. But I guess he was a brick mason before he was an accountant, even though that was never mentioned in the earlier novel. Plot holes. Plot holes. Anyway, and so then she talks about her latest hobby, teaching music to young children, all church music, because evidently during the apocalypse, she managed to take up the guitar. And then he goes back into another couple of paragraphs about, again, the laws of consecration. He was just railing about it earlier, and now, anyway. And how doctors and dentists that were doctors and dentists in the former, pre-coalition days are happy to help people with their medical problems, and talking about how very little meat was available, and so they were trying to raise cows and things like that, and that every house or apartment in Zion, in New Jerusalem, because it's kind of spread out, it's not one big site, it pretty much takes up the whole state of Missouri, part of Kansas. They're all required to grow their own garden, again, forced to grow their own garden to feed their family, and then anything that's left over is donated to the bishop's storehouse where everybody can partake. You know who had a similar system? Chad? Stalin. That's what Stalin did. He came for the farmers first and basically told them that he was taking everything that they had and redistributing it to everybody. The farmers didn't like that, and they set their crops on fire, and a lot of them ended up in gulags. So what you're describing here, you have to farm for the common good, is exactly what Stalin did. And you were just railing about, the bailouts that Obama did to bring us out of a recession. He didn't nationalize the banks. He gave them some money so we all wouldn't lose all of our stuff. So there you go. And then he talks about how they're having to make a lot of overnight Mormons, and there's people, all kinds of religions coming in, and they're accepting them, but they have to become Mormons, and that it was really difficult for these people to adhere. Well, yeah, I mean, we've just been through the supposed destruction of the United States, and now they find a group of people that will accept them, and we're going to give you a house, but you have to grow a garden, and anything over what your family needs has to be given to society. And that's okay. If a little community wants to do that, that's very libertarian. But when you do that by force, that's not libertarian. That's redistribution of wealth. Anyway, he again talks about how the law of consecration is the best way to live. And he's pretty much preaching Mormon doctrine through these first few chapters. And then, this is the best thing. Every house has a simple computer. I don't know what brand, but it has a simple computer that could log on to the Churchrun Internet. That sounds a lot like a nationalized internet to me. That's what China does. Called Zoom. We've all heard of that. And how they were allowed to have access to certain things. Books by Mormon authors were online. A lot of people worked translating and digitizing all these Mormon books. He talked about how there were so many brilliant LDS authors who wrote so many brilliant books before this happened, and how Emma was working a few hours a night helping to put all of this stuff online so that they would have access to it. They had restarted the BYU education system. You now had a BYU Zion branch. And basically this church-ran internet was all you had access to. And it was all church or government-ran media. That's a theocracy, Chad. And you combine that with the redistribution of wealth, you've pretty much got what a lot of the Middle Eastern governments have. A theocratic communist society. That's what you're exposing here, or espousing here. And and this is it. Like, there is music and media, but it's all religious. And he literally says that there's a new generation of Osmond-like boy bands that are now part of this new culture. It's only been a year, Chad. How much of a society have you been able to build in a year? The Walking Dead is a much more realistic presentation of how a society could rebuild after a catastrophe. And, we're into 10 years after the original zombie virus, and they're still not anywhere near this advanced. This is a year, and you're talking about all these advances within a year. And then he talks about Emma, who had worked for an LDS publishing company before and was helping to translate these books. Isn't your daughter's name Emma? And didn't you write a book about a character named Emma in your own Mormon? A lot of this is weird, Chad. It's just weird. And so anyway, that's kind of what society looks like. And so then we cut to the First Presidency's main chamber, where a lot of the apostles are sitting around. And In the middle of it, there is a gentleman by the name of Dale Turley, who Chad describes as one of the wealthiest men in the world. He had made billions from the financial industry and was a poster boy for Mormonism for some time. I don't know if this person actually exists, probably not. But he had this massive mansion in southern Utah and was a state president at the time of the invasion. He did guide his ward or his stake to safety into the mountains and help them sustain by giving his own resources to help sustain them, and then led them here to Zion, where he and his wife agreed to live by, again, the laws of consecration, and basically was living in a small 2-bedroom house that was built in the 60s, and he was working 12 hours a day on a construction crew, and he was just lamenting that he really wanted the ability to do well for himself, just like capitalism. And he also said that he felt he was being underutilized as part of a construction crew, working with, he said, quote unquote, a bunch of Guatemalans I don't even know. Well, of course, Josh got mad because he said they were just as much Mormon as him, and there was this whole argument. And then basically, the president kind of shuts him down and says, yes, you've made valuable contributions. We admire what you have, but we're building Zion. Did you really expect this to be done overnight? He says, no. But I also think that if we put everything forth into a more capitalistic system, we could build Zion a lot faster. And they pretty much, it was a whole chapter of them browbeating this man into submission, and he was told to either love it or leave it, that's what it was. And then they talk about, Steve Young being there, who was a Mormon, San Francisco quarterback, from BYU was there building houses. A former Miss Utah was building houses and assembling wheelchairs for the handicapped. And basically they browbeat him into submission. And then Josh thinks, as he looks at the prophet, how old and feeble the prophet looks. And remember how Chad said that it reminds him of a current president? Well, he's about to kill him off. He just said that this prophet looks weak and was hoping he would make it to the second coming of Christ, but it wasn't going to happen. He was obviously about ready to pass through the veil, and then Josh just kind of wonders who will be the next prophet, the next president. And then we cut back to Doug, who has made it to Washington, D.C., to the Washington, D.C. Mormon Temple, and is trying to get in. And then through the gate, he sees the face of a friend he knew before the invasion by the name of Billy Fox. They were teenagers together in Springville, Utah. And Billy recognizes him as well and lets him in. And then Billy starts to tell what happened in Washington during the invasion, that the coalition forces had targeted the electrical grid first. They had cut off all of the power stations through the entire region to cripple everything. He said that then they began their invasion and slow killing. All the politicians either went into hiding or got away. According to remember the other series, some of the politicians, including the president, were in on the invasion. So they had pretty much sold us out. They haven't come to this yet, but remember that's who was living in the Denver airport. It was the coalition leaders and the Americans that had sold out their country. And among that was the unnamed president, who we now know he was talking about Obama because he named him. So that's what goes on in Chad Daybell's world. But still, we don't know that here. And so Billy talks about how they had a generator in the basement of the temple and managed to keep the temple's running. He said it's been really strange because he hasn't seen any coalition troops at all. They've pretty much been barricaded in this temple. And Doug tells him, you don't have to worry about that anymore. They're gone. We killed them all. And we built Zion, and you should come with us. And Billy, of course, is very excited about this proposition and decides that, yes, he will help him, but first they want to search Washington, D.C. area, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, all the area immediately around D.C. for survivors to see if they have any that they can lead back to Zion. At this temple is a young lady by the name of Phyllis. She's about 19, 20 years old, and Billy introduces her to Doug, and Doug immediately feels a father-like connection to her. And he asks about her. He says, well, my family wasn't LDS. We were religious, but we weren't LDS. And she tells him her story, how they lived in a Baltimore suburb, and how they survived. Their family did not get the chip, and they managed to survive the first onslaught of the coalition forces because they were kind of tucked away in a little rural community. And they managed to stay alive because they were preppers, and they had stocked food pantry and everything that they need. But then looters started to come into the neighborhood, and she said one day 6 armed men, broke into their house, killed her father and her brother. She said she happened to be upstairs, and she ran immediately to her room and climbed out the window and hid behind the chimney on the roof. And she said while she was up there, she heard the screams of her mother and little sister, knowing they had killed them too. And then she stayed hidden behind that chimney for 48 hours, listening to the men take everything in the house, the food, and talk about what they were going to do. And eventually, she got her chance. She climbed down, and she ran towards Washington, D.C., and that's where Billy found her and brought her back to the temple. So, great, happy, inspirational story there, Chad. Great. And so she was all excited then about this celestial city, and Doug told her it was absolutely true and they were going to go there. But first, he and Billy had an idea to go to Washington, D.C. and see what they could recover. They're literally looking for the original copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and anything else they can find that they can take back to Zion with them. So they go to Washington, D.C., or they're already in Washington, but they go down to Pennsylvania Avenue, and they get to the Hall of Archives is what they called it. I think you might be talking about the Smithsonian. But they get there, and it says he breaks his heart to see the relics of the country he once loved. But they do find all these marvelous relics from the United States. And so they looked around the Smithsonian. They got a few artifacts there. They went into the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, and they used a sledgehammer to break out the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence, and take them back to Zion to be put into a museum there. Then the entire 400 of them, there were 400 people living in that temple evidently, they start making their way toward New Jerusalem. And with that, I'm going to end part 1 of Rise of Zion. I'll be back real soon with parts 2 and probably 3, because this is going to be another one of those. But I'll be back really soon, and until then, Keto Comic.